Before we start doing any fun stuff in the shop, like creating sawdust, cutting up boards, making a whole bunch of noise, first thing that we have to understand is how to measure things so that everybody's on the same page. How big is this board right here? I have no idea. How about this one? I have no idea. Anybody have any idea what size this board is? I have no idea. The truth of the matter is, until we learn how to read a standard English ruler, we're just guessing at numbers. And the most critical thing in the shop is to understand exactly what you're going to do, and that way you could measure twice and always cut once. The type of system that we're going to use, our standard English system, has two major rules that you should know about. The number one rule is to always look at the size of the line. Whenever we're taking a measurement on a ruler, you look at the length of the line that appears on that standard English ruler. The second thing, and I know it's going to be a little strange, is to understand that whenever we count the lines on a standard English ruler, we always want to make sure that we count those numbers odd. Now, unfortunately, the standard English ruler has fractions, unlike our friend, the metric system, which we're really not going to use. Where's the metric system used? Everywhere else in the world, but the United States. Of course, we stay with the standard English system, even though in England, they use the metric system. Let's take a look at the metric system first. The metric system is based on the number 10. That's the most critical thing. There are no fractions in the metric system, which makes it nice for people who have a hard time dealing with fractions. There are prefixes that replace the fractions, and that's important. There's always whole numbers. So you don't have to worry about fractions. All you have to do is count. But unlike our standard English system, the metric system is broken down into 10 equal parts. If the distance from this end to this end right here equals 1 meter, which is what the metric system is based on, if I wanted to get more specific and find smaller measurements along the metric system, what I would do is I would take the distance from here to here and divide it into 10 equal parts. So what I'm going to do here is simply divide it into 10 equal parts. Each one of those parts are no longer a meter. Each one of those parts are now referred to as a decimeter. A decimeter is basically 1/10 of a meter, or it's a meter stick divided into 10 equal parts. If I wanted to get more specific than this measurement from here to here, that decimeter, all I have to do is take this unit of measure and divide that into 10 equal parts as well. So I'm going to take this area and break that down into 10 equal parts. Even though it's that small, I'll still give it a shot. If I break this down into 10 equal parts, each one of those parts are no longer decimeters. Each one of those parts become what's referred to as a centimeter. A centimeter is 100 parts. Decimeter was only 10 parts. And believe it or not, if I want to get something even more specific than that little area, I'm going to take that area and break that down into 10 equal parts. I'll do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. 10. 10. If I did that across the entire meter stick, what I would have is 1,000 equal parts, and each one of those things is called a millimeter. These are all tens on the negative side. I'm taking a meter, I'm breaking it down into 10 equal parts. I'm breaking it down into 10 equal parts again, 10 equal parts again. There is also 10 on the plus side. In other words, if from the distance from here to here is 1 meter, if I took 1 meter and I put them end to end, creating 10 meters, 10 meters is referred to as a decameter. A decameter is 10 equal meters put end to end. If I wanted to take 10 meters and now add more meters to it to get a bigger area, I would refer to that as a hectometer. A hectometer is 100 meters. And the final measurement, which a lot of people are realizing when they drive, a kilometer is equal to 1,000 meters. So when we think about how long a kilometer is, take 39.5 inches, multiply that by 1,000, and that will give you 1 kilometer. This is the standard metric system that you would use anywhere in the world. It's all based on the meter. What we're going to do now is we're going to contrast that to the system that we're going to use all the time in here, and that is a standard English ruler system. So let's go over here and we'll explain that. Standard English system is based on an inch. An inch used to be the distance from the end of the lip to the tip of the nose. That's how scientific it is. That's an inch. In my case, that's the inch. An inch has 2 rules that you always have to remember whenever you're breaking it down. The first rule is to look at the size of the line. That will answer the question, what is it? The second rule is to count odd. And it's not going to be the normal 1, 2, 3. We're counting odd. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15. That will answer the question, how many? Now, right now, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look and we're going to break down an inch on the board right here. The longest line on a standard English ruler is an inch. If I look at any lines that are on here, that one is the longest. Therefore, that is an inch. The inch is one possibility that any measurement could be. If I take a line and I draw it smack dab in the center of this measurement from here to here, that line basically takes the inch and divides it into 2 equal parts. So what I have really created is a ½ inch. That ½ inch takes this unit and makes 2 parts out of it. I want to get more specific than just 2 parts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 2 parts and I'm going to divide those into smaller equal parts as well. If you notice, this line right here is shorter than this one here. This line is shorter than this one, and it's also shorter than that one. Those 2 measurements, here and here, are quarters. I've taken the inch and I've divided it into 4 equal parts. Therefore, this is a quarter, this is a quarter. If I want to get more specific than quarters, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line in between those 2 lines, in between those 2, in between those 2, and in between those 2. What I have created here are eighths. So I have an eighth here, an eighth here, an eighth here, an eighth here. Quarters, half, and an inch. The final measurement that you have to be concerned about is the smallest measurement on a standard ruler, and that are these little lines right here, dividing the eighths. Each one of those is referred to as a 1/16 of an inch. So I have a 1/16 here, a 1/16 here, a 1/16 here. If I were to count these up, I introduce the second rule, which says that I'm supposed to count odd. So if I wanted to identify this measurement right here, it's 1/16. This one, 3/16, 5/16, 7/16, 9/16. For the eighths, there's 1/8, 3/8, 5/8, 7/8. For the quarters, there's 1/4, 3/4. For the half, 1/2. If you notice, always, the odd number is on the top, the even number is on the bottom. If I wanted to identify this particular measurement right here, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the size of the line. The size of the line will answer the question, what is it? Looking at the size of that line, I could tell it's the smallest line on a standard English ruler. Therefore, that measurement right there happens to be a 1/16. But the question is, how many? I don't have a top number. So what I'm going to do is start from the beginning and count odd only the 1/16 inch marks. And when I count them, I'm going to count them odd. So this becomes 1/16, 3/16, 5/16, and when I get to this one, it's 7/16. So the correct measurement for that particular line is 7/16 of an inch. When you get good at this, you'll be able to do this as 1/16, 1/8, 3/16, 1/4, 5/16, 3/8, 7/16, 1/2, 9/16, 5/8, 11/16, 3/4, 13/16, 7/8, 15/16 an inch. That's when you become proficient at this. So what we'll do is we'll just go through a couple more examples to see if you could determine what these measurements are. What I want to do is I want to identify this measurement. If you look at the size of the line, the first thing you ask yourself is, what is it? Is it an inch, a half, a quarter, an eighth, or a 16th? It could only be one of those 5 measurements. If I look at the size of the line, it's not the longest, so it's not an inch. It's not the second longest, that's the half. It's not a quarter because those are this measurement right here. So therefore, the bottom number is an eighth of an inch. I can determine that simply because of the size of the line. Now I want to know how many eighths there are. So I'm going to start from the beginning and I'm going to count odd. Remember, only the same size lines as the one that has to be identified. So if I look at this measurement, if I start from the beginning of this ruler, I don't count that line, but I do count this one because it's the same size as this. So that's 1. I don't count this one, this one, this one, but I do count this one. And since I'm counting odd, this becomes 3/8 of an inch. So the correct answer to this is 3/8 of an inch if I ask for what that measurement is right there. Let's do another example. We'll take off the 3/8 of an inch example, and I'll ask you to determine what this measurement is right here. If you look at that measurement right there, is it an inch, a half inch, a quarter of an inch, an eighth of an inch, or a 16th of an inch? Because the size of the line is the smallest, I will say that that's a 16th of an inch. Once again, how many 16ths are there? So I'm going to start from the beginning and only count the 16th lines. And when I count them, I'm always going to count them odd. So I will count this one, which is 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. The correct answer to this measurement right here is 11/16. Is there life after an inch? Most people think that the measurements end from here to here. What we have to remember is the tape measure that you're going to use in the shop is 12, 14 feet long. So there are measurements after an inch. If I put these measurements down here and ask you to determine what that measurement is right there, this measurement here is a 16th of an inch. But we don't count every single 16th because once you pass 1 inch, it becomes 1 and then you start all over again. So if I'm asking you to determine what that measurement is, once you pass 1 inch, you simply put 1 down. The second thing is you start it all over again. This is the smallest measurement on a standard ruler. So that measurement right there is a 16th of an inch. But once again, I'm going to count odd to get the numerator. So this becomes 1, this becomes 3. So 1 3/16 is the correct measurement. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our knowledge of the ruler and apply it to actual shop math. Exactly what you guys would do in here if you're working in the shop. Really common example of this is a lot of wood joinery that we have. When you cut that on the table saw, you find out that I'll ask you to raise the blade up to half the thickness of the wood. Well, the question is, if my wood is 3/4 of an inch thick, how high do I raise the blade? The truth of the matter is, all you have to do is apply the shop math to that problem. If I want to determine what half of a half is, most people remember from elementary school that it's 1/4 of an inch. But how did a half of a half become 1/4? Well, this is what your math teacher never told you. What they had you do was they had you divide it by 2, but then they said to you, you couldn't do that. So they said what you're going to do is switch the sign and take the inverse of 2. The inverse of 2 over 1 is 1 over 2. And then you multiply this by this and you get 1. You multiply this by this and you get 4. So therefore, half of a half is 1/4 of an inch. Yay! You got it. But they didn't tell you the easy part of that. The easy part of half of a half being 1/4 is that all I have to do is to take the denominator and multiply it by 2. That's true with any fraction. So if I look at this and I multiply 2 times 2, I get 1/4. What's half of 1/4? All you simply have to do is to multiply this by 2. Half of 1/4 is 1/8. What's half of an eighth? If I take the 8, multiply it by 2, I get 1/16. So what I'm basically doing is just multiplying the denominator by 2. It's the easiest thing. And you don't have to do anything to the numerator. Let's complicate that. Let's take a common fraction like 3/8 of an inch. I want to find out what half of 3/8 is. To do that, the same rule applied. All I do is multiply the denominator by 2. Half of 3/8 is equal to 3/16, and all of a sudden you become a math whiz. How about half of 3/16? If I multiply it by 2, I'm into 3/32. Ooh, that's a big number. That's a number to be afraid of because it's big. I can handle this number 8, but 32, ooh, that's scary. Can we further complicate this? Absolutely, and we can make it real easy. I'm going to now put a whole number in front of a fraction. Let's take a number like 2 3/8. I want to determine what half of 2 3/8 is. To do that, all I simply do is divide this into 2 equal parts. First of all, what is half of 2? Half of 2 is 1. What is half of 3/8? We already remembered that we simply multiply the denominator by 2. So half of 2 3/8 equals 1 3/16. How about a number that's maybe a little more complicated? Let's say like 6 7/8. Again, I'm going to determine what half of 6 is, and I think everybody knows that that's 3. Half of 7/8, to get half of 7/8, I'm simply going to multiply the denominator by 2. So half of 6 7/8 is really 3 7/16. One final example, I'm going to take a number like 8 1/4. What's half of 8 1/4? I simply take 8. What's half of that? It's 4. Now what I'm going to do is determine what half of a quarter is. I multiply this denominator by 2, and it becomes 4 1/8. Now there's somebody in this shop room who's really, really smart. And they're going to say to me, I could find half of this because this number is even, and I could find half of this number because this number is even, half of this one and half of this one because they're all even. But what about these? How do I find half of 3 7/16? I'll show you how to do that. Let's take an example, 5 1/2, which is an odd number, whole number fraction. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find half of 5 1/2. First thing I'm going to do is find half of the whole number. Half of 5 is 2 1/2. But what I'm going to do is something tricky on this. I'm going to keep the 2, and I'm going to just simply discard the half. Now I know that half of 5 1/2 could not possibly just be 2. It's got to be 2 in some fraction, so I'm going to need a fraction here. I'll draw my fraction line. And now what I'm going to do is determine the denominator. We said with any fraction, to find half of it, you're going to multiply the denominator by 2, and we'll do the same thing here. We'll multiply the denominator by 2. The tricky part comes for the new numerator. The new numerator is determined by taking the old fraction and adding the two numbers together. So if I add the 1 and the 2, I get 3, so half of 5 1/2 is 2 3/4. And that works for any fraction. Another example, if I take a number like 7 3/4, half of 7, we know is 3 1/2. We're going to keep the 3, and we're going to throw the half away. To find the fraction, we're going to take the 4 and multiply it by 2, which is going to give us the 8. And to get the new numerator, what I'm going to do is simply take the old fraction and recycle it. I'm going to add the 3 and the 4 to get 7. So half of 7 3/4 is 3 7/8, and it works every time. So when we think about what we did today, first thing we talked about was the metric system. Second thing, kind of went into a standard English ruler system, determined how to get the measurements from that. And the third thing was talk about some shop math. If you guys have any questions, see me. Hope this sunk in. And if there's any problems, I'll be around the shop.